Hi, everybody. This is Erica Mello and Susan Clinton, and welcome to episode 104. And this is an episode about one of my patients who I briefly spoke about her in episode 102 on the Clinical Pearls episode. She is a patient who's had a long-standing shoulder problem, and her main issues were her hand behind her back and overhead shoulder flexion. And her driver, lo and behold, her primary driver was obviously, that's why she's so interesting, is obviously not in her shoulder. And we talk about the differences between, getting someone's hand behind their back better versus an overhead straight plane shoulder flexion. So we look forward to you enjoying the episode. And also a couple of announcements. We've mentioned this on a few of our podcast episodes prior. We have a new Tough to Treat podcast membership club opening in the next couple of months. Susan and I are busy working on that. Right, Susan? And we've got a lot of great, you want to talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, we've been really working hard behind the scenes. We're really excited about it. We're going to be doing monthly interviews with people that are tough to treat rock stars that are, that everybody doesn't know. And we want to introduce you to people out there that are doing some cool things in the world of physiotherapy. And we also are planning to do a monthly Q&A where everyone is going to have an opportunity to hop on live with us at our Q&A monthly meeting. And if you are so interested and inclined to apply for a hot seat, well, you'll get about 20 minutes of our time on that Q&A to discuss a complicated case. So we're looking forward to some of the cool things we'll be adding and dropping into the membership for everybody.
Yeah, this is a highly interactive podcast, the Q&A, and I think it's one of a kind in our field. I don't know of any other podcast that does a live or Q&A like we do. So our website has been migrated over to a new platform now, toughtotreat.com. So if you haven't opted into our newsletter, our Clinical Pearls PDF is Susan's amazing sleep, chronic pain and sleep disturbances, really helpful material for your patients. Please do so. There's some information on the membership as well. So we hope you enjoy it. And one last thing, we had promised, we want to thank you all so much for leaving us a review and testimonial on wherever you listen to podcasts. And we're just going to pull up two names right now, and you're going to get a webinar that we've recorded on challenging patients. So the first person, if you are listening, is S. Warren PT. That is your podcast handle, S. Warren PT. And the next person is Megan Satinsky. So S. Warren PT and Megan Satinsky. If you are listening to this, we will send you a copy of the video, the webinar that we did. Please email myself, Erica at ericamello.com, or Susan at ltiphysio.com. This is a new email for Susan at ltiphysio.com. So now on to the episode. Hi, everybody. Welcome to episode number 104. And this is Erica Mello with my lovely co-host, Susan Clinton. Hi, Susan. How are you?
I'm good, Erica. Let's get to it and talk about this, because I think you're referencing another podcast that you did when you were about progressions. I think was podcast number 102. So if you haven't listened to 102, go and listen to it along with this one so that you can have the whole story.
Yes, this is about, this was the second patient on episode 102. So this is a woman in her late 50s. Late 50s. And actually, I treated her son for quite some time, and she came in to see me recently over the summer, and she had an issue. I would say it probably was, people who have shoulder problems, it's going to get better. They raise their arm, and the next thing you know, they can't move their arm. So I initially suspected frozen shoulder, but I don't think that's what she had. But she had a main issue. She couldn't it was her left arm. She's right dominant. She could not put her hand behind her back or do a single arm lift. Big, different movement patterns. And she had no other medical history of note. We always talk about our past movement injuries, our past movement history. She had chronic neck pain. Okay, that was her issue. Like, don't we all? Like, I have chronic neck issue, but she has a significant amount of, I'll go into it, a significant tone in her neck. So that was the main issue. And those are very different ones. And I don't know about you, but I often find this turned out not to be the case, but I often find that the hand behind the back is hard to restore than overhead, but it turned out it was the opposite with her. And so I can get into that a little bit. And I also talk a little bit about, we'll talk about impairments, like what is her impairment? So she is she's an office worker working from home here for an advertising agency here in New York. And just a lot of very high stress, runs the agency, and insidious onset, honestly, of shoulder pain. And I initially was like, okay, she really had limited movements in all planes, but it wasn't so limited in terms of like when you see a frozen shoulder where you're hypomobile generally in all the planes. It was generally just certain. It was overhead flexion, hand behind the back, obviously some internal rotation, external rotation with spine abduction was semi, I would say 80%. So this is what I did with her. I said, look, the hand behind the back is very different from an overhead movement. Let's prioritize. Hand behind the back is a bit harder to assess, but I'm happy to do that. And, we can proceed to show overhead movement. So I actually did hand behind the back because that was a big priority for her at the time. Her overhead shoulder flexion was limited to maybe 120, 130. It was not horrible, but she just couldn't get it up. She couldn't get her arm up all the way. And that was a problem. So, but her hand behind the back literally to her iliac crest.
Yeah. So problems pulling her pants up, doing things, reaching behind her.
Driving. Like when she reached, like if she wasn't, her son is learning to drive, so she'd be in the passenger seat. And every time she was her left, so she'd reach behind, she could not get into the back seat to reach something. So I think that was more in her brain because they were driving a lot back to the beach.
Yeah. It just shows the patient really wants to pick the priority. That's why she came to you, is like, that was a real issue for her.
Yeah. Yeah. And I said, and I often do that with patients. And if you find the driver in one movement, it generally translates over to others, and for sure. So it's not like you're forgetting to do a movement. The driver's all, pretty much the same with give or take. You may have a secondary issue, but I because I'm confident in my skills that I can assess the hand behind the back. So I gave her the choice, and she was like, let's do that, versus just doing an overhead shoulder flexion abduction. Not so meaningful, for her. And I wouldn't have gotten the buy-in so quickly. But the minute I said, so I sat her, I took a look at her in standing, as I always do, just to get an idea of where they are center of mass wise. I put her on the wall first. So I had her go into a normal, I'm here on my Zoom, my normal, like my hands on the wall, very, very narrow, like you're doing like a diamond. And then I had her go normal base of support. So hands on the wall, very close, narrow, normal, and wide. She was worse wide. Worse wide. Narrow, very easy. It was just everything was on, and the left part of her shoulder, anterior shoulder girdle, was on slack, so to speak. The minute she went wide, she felt like this pulling in her left pec, left upper thorax. So I wanted to do that before I even got her on the table, just to get an idea, because normally I see the opposite.
Yeah, normally it's harder for them to come in. They're better, wider.
Right. And so it was the same pattern on her hands and knees, just FYI. I actually did that eventually. Same thing.
Yeah, and that makes sense. It's like, it shouldn't change. If it's a, you're seeing that issue, there when you load her up, you're just loading a little bit differently on hands and knees, but it's the same thing. When she brought her hands close together on hands and knees, it was easier. When she came out, it was harder.
Yes, exactly. So I sat her. So then I sat her down on the plinth. I said, just put your hand behind your back, just, and then it went to the iliac crest. The first thing I saw, scapular elevation, neck, cervical spine, left side bend, cervical, scapular elevation, and significant tone in her neck. That's the first thing I saw. Like she couldn't get her hand behind her back. The left shoulder hiked up, the scapula elevated, and her left shoulder went down. Her left ear went to her shoulder. That was the first thing. And I was like, okay. And I knew she had a chronic neck problem. I said, let me just go. And, I had her do her eyes. I said, and we talked about the eyes. I said, can you kind of look when you do that to see if it actually helps just a little bit? Because she's doing this, looking straight ahead at the wall, and because she has to turn her head to reach behind her back in the car. So I said, just turn your head when you do that. And that was about the same. No better, no worse. So what I noticed that, when you have people, they're sitting on the plinth, they're sitting in a chair, and you put your hands on their neck, and their paraspinals are like on fire. You cannot even get in and can't feel anything. You can't even move the tissue aside. That's how tight her neck was. So what I did initially is I stuck my hand under her axilla. And I said, let me just give you, so I said, shrug your shoulder. She shrugged her shoulder. I stuck my hand under her axilla just to give her some support to the upper traps in the neck. I said, let's see how far you can take your hand behind your back now to see if I can take out that scap elevation. It went 30% better, a little bit. I know, like, wow, this is so much better. But she's like, oh, that's better. Oh, that's better, And so then I said, okay. I went up to her neck, just because of a gut feeling of her, because she had a chronic neck issue. And so I went on to her, for purposes of the podcast, I'll just, you don't have to be as detailed here, but I went in under her occipital condyles. I gave her a little distraction on her occiput, on her C1, C2.
In sitting? Was she in sitting?
In sitting.
Yeah, we're just basically doing traction, just kind of coming up underneath the head and doing that general lift.
Right. And I was trying to get out of the muscle tones. It was so prominent. And I did that. I said, just, I just closed my eyes. I centered myself. And then I said, take a couple deep breaths. And I said, after the third breath, just reach your hand behind her back. It was like 70% better. It's just like, right.
And it makes sense if you think about her driving, trying to reach behind the seat and turning, and the shoulder coming up and the neck coming over, and the car's bouncing around, and her son's there, and
right, and he's learning to drive.
Right, so there's stress and tension, and everything else that's going on.
Yeah,
and that made it better by 75%. That's amazing. The power of just doing a little traction to just see how that, because all the muscles of the shoulder are controlled by the nerves coming out of the neck.
Right, exactly. And I said to myself, that's the first thing I saw. I mean, it was like, the minute she initiated the movement, it was this, 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 and this. So, I mean, I'm saying this, and this, and you can't see me, but it was shoulder elevation, side bend, and then it was restricted. So I figured, let me just take out that, I don't even want to call it a compensation of a pattern that's not serving her. And when I ended up just giving her, honestly, a little bit of distraction, it was significantly better. I explained to her that this was temporary. I'm temporarily optimizing, whatever. I usually tell patients I'm doing what your muscles should be doing. Easy explanation. They get it. She's like, oh my God, I can't believe it. I did the same thing. I said, okay, let me just see if that works for the overhead, just for the heck of it. Let me just try it. She's on the plinth. I said, just lift your arm up. I saw the same movement pattern, but to a lesser extent. I put my hands on her glenohumeral joints, like from behind, and just sort of cup them. And I said, just lift your arm up. And I felt a lot of medial compression. I said, okay, there could be something secondary here. I left that in my brain, wrote it down. And what I ended up thinking, I'm like, well, okay, her neck is probably not it's probably a primary issue for her overhead movement, but it's not. There's another issue. Okay. So what I ended up doing is I actually got her down on, I assessed the neck. However we all want to assess the neck, I did. I did some, I don't generally get people in prone too much anymore for the head, but I did do, your pivums and a little bit of your, pavums from AP, PA, AP from supine. I did all that. I mean, I did check a little bit of, I actually checked her in a slump. I take that back. I checked her in a slump test before even though I didn't think it was neurally driven. I mean, everything's neurally driven at the end of the day, but I didn't think that. I wanted to see what she did in a slump. So I had her sit on the edge of the table, just do a full sit slump, drop the head, extend the knees, reach your hand behind your back. Not much. I mean, the same. I mean, it wasn't worse. It wasn't worse. I had her sit up and do the same thing, but everything's straight. But I had her extend her leg, that was about the same. So when I got her down on her in supine, I ended up having her doing just a little bit of a nod of the head. And I just said, just hold that there for a second, bend your knees and drop your knees to the left. And she did, and I felt a huge pull on her neck. So there's something intrinsic to the system, right, Susan? Like the nervous system with that, right? Because it involved a lot of rotation, especially driving, I felt, let me just try lower trunk rotation in supine from the below, and then see if I feel any pulling on the neck. I had her reach her arm, had her in supine, I had her shifted over, I had her arm off the table. I said, just do some, back and forth, try to get her into some shoulder extension while I did that. That was also quite restricted. So I felt that there was something intrinsic in the anterior part of, I don't even want to say dural system, but there's something pulling from below as well secondarily. Is that making sense to people? I'm not sure if that makes sense. Does that, Susan?
Yeah, I think it does.
Yeah. Okay. So reason why I wanted to bring her up is, so I treated her neck, but my question is that, what is the impairment? We always talk about the impairment. Does she have weak neck flexors, weak multifidus, or is it an overactive system? I believe it was an overactive system.
Yeah, it sounds like it. Yeah, especially the way you were describing how the muscles were really over recruiting the paraspinals and things that, in her neck. So
yes. So I'm going to sort of fast forward a little bit because I want to get to her overhead. I actually had her because she wanted to know what she could do at home because she had a lot of tone. Every time I went into her neck and I just did a little bit I did suboccipital release. I do a lot of dynamic work because her shoulder was her pain generator. Okay. I had her move her arm in like reverse flies, overhead flexion, hanging off the bed, in sitting behind her back while I was working on her neck. I literally, you could get the person back and sitting, do some distraction to their neck and have her move her hand behind her back, or just do arm swings as a treatment. I had her do that in supine on a table. I was doing a little bit of distraction, suboccipital release, had her move her arm off the table. She was hanging off the table and she did that. And so I did a lot of dynamic work. I had her take a pencil eraser at home to literally go in and release some of those suboccipital muscles with the pencil eraser. That was very helpful for her. And I ended up, I didn't really give her. So we talk about exercise prescription. Her main issue, her driver was her neck. So did I need to give her a strengthening program from her neck? No, I did not. It was really an overactive system, but I needed to train the movement pattern that was bothering her while her neck was in a, I don't want to say better position with her, while her neck was while a lot of her superficial muscles were not overactive. So I started in supine first. I had her in, I have access to a Pilates equipment. So I had her in the Cadillac. I had her take her arm on the wooden, the drop down bar. So it's her left arm. So I gave her imagery. Imagine your head is really tall. Imagine you've got a hook in between your cervical vertebrae. Imagine someone's pulling a rope from the top of your head. So she would lean back, take her left arm out and move it into like some shoulder extension, horizontal abduction, and then lean back with the imagery of her neck. So she would be sort of, Eric Franklin-like imagery while she moved her arm. Was I giving her cuff exercises? No, not every shoulder patient needs cuff work. Her driver was her neck.
Yeah. And so having her work on the muscles of her neck, getting some visualization of lengthening, and just really helping her see that when she changed what was happening at her neck, her shoulder got better. So, we this is kind of the whole idea of, where the neurology is coming from. And, just the neck has been tight, and she's had some issues for a long time there. And now it's just presenting as a new pain issue. The pain is being presented in the shoulder now with limitation of movements than before, when it was probably just being presented in the neck. So,
yes.
Her brain got used to the fact that this is the way it is. And then it started beginning again, that we can adapt until we can't. And then, the adaptation started to kind of crumble around her shoulder. And she started getting, into positions that were not working well for her.
Right. Exactly. And I think the treatment is such that we have to remember, what's the impairment? Does she have a weak cuff? Does she have overactive? So yeah, it was an overactive superficial system. So imagery and breathing, any relaxation techniques that you can offer is great. Could be, at some point you're going to wean off the hands-on, obviously, but if they want to do a little pencil eraser to their suboccipital muscles, that's fine. But the imagery was very helpful, because that's how I was able to get her hand behind her back in the evaluation at 75% better. She was thinking about lengthening her spine. So any exercise that I did on the Pilates equipment, whether it's on the catalog with the roll down, arm out to the side, I had her, I had her on her hands and knees. This was interesting because I had her start narrow, because that is actually where she felt better. I had her go into child's pose. Imagine your neck is long, going into child's pose, go rock back and forth. That's what I gave her. I eventually moved her out to wider arms. Getting her to wider arms, I admit, took a bit. That was tough. And I'm wondering if there was some neural tone there that I missed, or there was just something that was like a connection to her, from her neck to her shoulder and her scapula, where that made that wide worse, because it's usually the opposite. So I just went with it, and I just said, let's go narrow, normal, wide on the hands and knees. We'll progress you. And she eventually got there. Really was mostly to her neck. I will admit, I did not, at the beginning, I did tape her into scapular elevation just to give her some relief. But that was off pretty quickly, like I would say 2 sessions. I stopped that because she had to drive and all that, or actually her son did. But I got her pretty quickly. So then this leads to her overhead. So her overhead, with that treatment, her overhead movement.
Before we go to overhead, I just have a question for you. When you had her on her hands and knees, and she was better with her hands narrow, and then you started moving her out, did you play around with internal rotation and external rotation? Was one better than the other?
So her internal rotation was better. Her external was not.
Yeah, that's interesting, because she lacked internal rotation of the humerus in the extended position. So the flex position, it was okay.
Yes.
In 90 degrees of flexion on hands and knees, but external rotation was not okay. Yeah, interesting. Very interesting.
Yeah.
So overhead then.
Yeah. So then I also just had her weight shift. So when she was going very narrow, I said, go to the right, go to the left. So when she went to the left, obviously that was harder. This was her left arm, and it was just more pulling. It was pulling on the left shoulder. Going to the right was easier. So I had her do a lot of things that actually made her feel better, just to get volume and get her weight bearing. I actually got her on the reformer as well. People who do a knee stretch, I had her start in narrow and do the imagery, and I had her do knee stretch, and I had her push out with her arms, then push out with her with the carriage. So that got her, I would say, 40 degrees shy of full shoulder flexion overhead. And then that's where the rubber meets the road, because that was hard to get at her, because I said to myself, look, I've gotten so far. Every time I went in and did the same correction to the neck, I gave her a little distraction, gave her imagery, breathing to her neck. Literally, for those of you who do the visceral work, I would go in, I inhibited some of those upper cervical muscles. I did get more shoulder flexion, but I did not get her all the way. So, that was where I was getting a little frustrated, because she had gotten so much better, and, it was immediate. I mean, it wasn't quick to get the hand behind the back, but she got it. And it was just a process, but the overhead was a lot harder. So you add your thoughts on that, or do you want me to keep going?
No, go ahead. I'm interested to see what happened next.
Yeah, so it was tough. So I don't believe in sitting there, because I was really at some point like, hey, maybe she has a frozen shoulder, but if she did, she was beyond the painful phase, because she wasn't really in a ton of pain. It was just stiffness, she said. It was very stiff. I tried her on her hands and knees on the reformer again, and I instead of me cranking on it, I was like, let me see what her brain will do on its own. I had her just get in a comfortable position on the reformer, or even in child's pose, go back as far as you can go comfortably, and then you would see at her limitation, shoulder, scap elevation, the same pattern, common. So what I ended up doing, you're going to laugh. I actually got her seated on the plinth with her arms in like a crisscross, like an I Dream of Jeannie pose. So I
Mm-hmm.
put like a pillow or two on there, and I had her rest her head. So her head was resting, no muscle tone at all going
Mm-hmm.
on, supposedly. And then I ended up having her lean. I was behind her. I was just sort of, my hands were on her. I wasn't really doing, I was just sort of giving her, some patients want to feel felt. So I just had my hands on her head. I mean, that's all I did. And then I said, lean forward, like you're going to lean forward and reach your arms out, like you're going into, like you're extending your spine. So the patient's facing the plinth on your stool, hands are in my dream of genie position and on pillows, and they're literally just leaning forward. And I had her in some internal rotation, and she got pretty far with that.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting.
So right, because her neck was not working.
Yeah.
You want to make a
No,
question?
I'm just kind of thinking, because with the arms crossed, you're in that, kind of that nears position, with the shoulder impingement, and she was able to go further. So it wasn't an impingement. I know some of them, you all out there are thinking she's has an impingement because she can only go so far, and then the scapula starts to elevate. But it's not, because you have her in a nearest position, really, in that thing, and she's able to kind of, when she moves her trunk, her arms go better than when she moves her arms on a still trunk. So a moving trunk, just, like it's just the opposite of, like doing closed chain. Like we either move the arm in open chain, or we move the arms where the arms are fixed and the trunk is moving.
Yeah.
And that actually helped her, kind of reversing that, help the movement system figure something out a little bit differently.
Right. Exactly. Which is why I brought her up, because she wasn't your typical shoulder patient impingement. I don't tend to see, we don't tend to see your typical by the time they get to us, but I saw her first because I treated her son. Right. So so that's why, so when I had her on the plinth, and all of a sudden I said, let me just go in and, just do once again, I just did a listening, I just put my hand on her, on the back of her. This is a visceral technique. And I just felt like a pull into her shoulder or lats. It's like, let me just try to inhibit that. Let me just give her some input to the lat, just something, because, and I trust the listening, and, you can take that for what it's worth, but I do that. And I said, let me just inhibit a couple muscle groups that I think that, once again, the impairment, this woman did not need a strengthening program, which is why I'm bringing her up. She did not need cuff strengthening. She didn't have an anterior deltoid strength pull at all, that you commonly see in patients like this. It was an overactive system. All right. So I just, put my thumb literally on her, like the lat insertion. I said, just kind of, keep going, just go back and forth. You're still sitting on the plinth, move your arms back and forth. By the end of 10 reps, I had her breathing. She was almost full.
Mm-hmm.
She was almost full. And I just put my hand on her lat. I mean, once again, you can take that for what it's worth, and I dissect that on your own, but we do things differently. And I think that no matter what you do, you have to sort of hone in on the area that you think is the driver. And with her, but you have to watch them move and put them in different movement patterns.
Mm-hmm.
I would not have seen that if I didn't have her hands crossed and having her do it on the plinth.
Right.
Right. Because so when I went in and I just did an inhibition of her lats and a couple, and she good. I said, oh my gosh. And so she sat back up, and she's like 170 degrees right there. I couldn't believe it. I could not believe it. That did not last though. Okay. So I want your thoughts. I mean, this is where we're at. So she's away now, but I ended up giving her a lot of things on her hands and knees, very narrow, normal, wide, going into shoulder flexion now, still with the imagery of lengthening the head. Okay. She doesn't have access to Pilates, so she doesn't do that on her own. She wanted to know, she could, maybe Theragun, say a Theragun, like her shoulder. I'm like, you can't really get at your lat insertion, so that's going to be really hard to do. But I said, you can do a nice stretch of your lats. This is the brain. I said, explain to her, all the hypertonicity that you have in your neck is just the neurological tone it's just, that's the nervous system. I said, what you want to end up doing is go on your hands and knees, move your hands to the right, both hands to the right, and sit back. And she was able to do that full and feel a stretch in her lats. And then I said, do that 5 times, hold that for 30 seconds, sit back up and check your arm. She's like 10 degrees shy right now. So
it's like a nice reset exercise is to just lengthen the lats.
Right.
And lengthen the lats and lengthen the neck.
Yeah.
Because the lat is over recruiting. So, and the way that you have
Right.
her doing, it's not really stretching. It's just more like just giving input to the system to where you can let go and eccentrically elongate
Right.
and allow that shoulder to move into that position. So that's great because now she
Yeah.
has a way to kind of reset herself. And if she does that often enough, the hope here is that the movement system will start to change and become more nimble and
Right.
not
So
be
my
stuck in that same pattern all the time.
exactly. So my question to you is, and anybody for the listeners, is we're literally, because I don't believe in cranking on people's shoulders until they're crying. That's not appropriate, and I would never want that done to me. You think about it. Would you want that done to you? No, I wouldn't. And the ironic thing is, when I've had low back pain, if someone touches my back or manipulates my back, run for the doors. Okay, and that's part of a clinical prediction rule. I do not fit that standard. I'm the outlier there. Do not touch me. Same with my neck. If my neck is on, do not touch me. It makes me worse. So I'm one of those types. So with her, I'm seeing her like after Labor Day, and I'm assuming, she's be pretty okay, but I have a funny feeling she'll be still lacking a bit. I spent most of the time with her on her hand behind her back because that was meaningful for her, and she was thrilled. So we moved on to overhead, and the neck work got her better. And then once again, I put her in different positions. So think about different positions, how you can challenge the movement that you're trying to get better with different input, internal, external, seated, I dream of genie poses, whatever, and see if you can try and challenge their movement system, give their brain a different context to see if they can figure out how to get more movement. And she did. So my question to you is, any other ideas for her to get the last 10 degrees?
Well,
It's
it's kind of
important
an
to her.
interesting thing. And one of the things to bring up too is that for your clients who can't get on their hands and knees, or they're not going to be comfortable sitting doing that, or they don't really have a way to do that at home, is they can stand and put their, I dream of genie arms on the sink and walk backwards, and
Yes.
they can do it on the wall, like you talk about with like wall dog, with their hands in different positions and twisting, to really kind of get that in. But the thing, I think that the loading part is like key for her. When her arms are loaded, she does better. And I'm just wondering about like now, when you see her again, what would it look like if she, rolled a ball up the wall? If she was able, keeping with the dynamic theme, but some input coming in at the hand, seems to be something that's working for her, somehow loading the arms a little bit. And if she could actually roll the ball up sideways and, kind of like roll into rotations a little bit,
Yep.
and things like that, and or even just hold the ball on the wall and drop down, drop into
Yes.
trunk,
Yes.
bringing the trunk down so that the arm flexes, but having to kind of like control the ball.
Yeah.
You can use a bigger ball or a smaller ball, it doesn't really matter, I think, but just so she has to kind of control it like we would do with ankles, or leg, perturbations, as they kind of stand on foam pieces and different surfaces and stuff, and like what's happening at the hand there.
Yes.
And is, can the hand, by bringing the whole piece in, because the nerves are all such long tracking nerves, input
Yes.
from anywhere should be part of the change into the neck. And that I'd be interested to see kind of how she is able to kind of do that. How does she do with pushing doors open and pulling doors?
Yeah.
Which one's still the best or the worst, or what is she avoiding, or or what's the pattern looking like? But it seemed, keeping with the dynamic theme seems to be a good piece for her, because she's able to control that, and so just making the controlling a little more unpredictable.
Yep.
Because she could do controlled practice things that she could expect, and it brought about changes, which was like wonderful because she kind of like could take that over. But if you could make it more uncontrollable now, but still dynamic, to see kind of how her system responds and how nimble it is and how much has changed.
Yes, exactly. So I did give her at the beginning, like hands on the wall, like a wall squat. And then I had her do the normal narrow wide there, wall squat with the hand positions. Then I had her hands on the wall and had her walk side to side, and then the pencil release. That was what I gave her I would say at the beginning. I didn't give her a lot to do at home, but I gave her those three things, and that helped. Then I transitioned to on her hands and knees. I like the hand input because She does well on closed chain on the reformer with the knee stretch and pushing back. And I challenged the arms. It's the widers where I'm challenged right now. So I do like that ball on the wall sideways.
And she can move her trunk around into whatever position and find the edge. Like if it's here, how far can I go? How far can I turn my trunk away from the wall?
Yes.
And then she's on the ball, she has that ability to do that rotational stuff, and maybe even just kind of the position of her hand.
Yes.
Does she roll off to the side of her hand? Does she roll more into the internal? Can she keep her hand, kind of in a, like we do with the foot? Can, the hand be in contact and not just part of the hand be in contact, but the whole hand, being in contact to kind of see if that input has some, offers some differences for her to be able to gain some motion.
Yeah, exactly. And that's also great for the neural, like any kind of neural flossing too, Yeah.
Rainbows on the wall, standing facing the wall, standing sideways. How far can she go with the rainbow coming back? How far can she coming over? Does she need to dip down in the middle of the rainbow to come around? That's okay. But just having her kind of she's apparently good with images. So painting some pictures on the wall might be, something that will speak to her, temporal part of her brain to make some changes. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and it's interesting that you mentioned the wall, because at the end range shoulder flexion, we need to externally. We're not going up straight. We need a little bit of external rotation on top of shoulder flexion, right?
It's a concomitant motion. So
exactly. So people who have those problems, or if you have patients who have that, external rotation, doing that against the wall is a great way to get that end range flexion. And I think the reason why I wanted to bring her up is because it's the impairment. It is not a strength problem with her. Okay. And I did a lot of, supine release on the table, having her dynamically move.
Right.
The key with her is dynamic, but dynamic movement in the sense of the brain is letting the muscles move in a better way, allows the brain to choose a better movement pattern versus just doing straight plane TheraBand with cuff. That is no way going to cut it with her. That would never have gotten her better at all. And I just think with the clinical reasoning, with the hands on the wall, the normal narrow wad, I thought that drove a lot of my treatment, because that normally is the opposite. So that little light bulb went off in my brain. So for those of you who want like an exercise program, I really just gave her the wall squats, the pencil release, and the side to side, as I mentioned earlier. I proceeded to hands on the floor. And I mean, on hands and knees, and the lat stretching. I did give her a little yellow TheraBand, like very easy, but this was more for imagery. I just had her do some, pushing out against the yellow TheraBand 5% and just do overhead movement with her head on a small overball. Okay, that was the neck. So have her just get her head on a small teeny ball and have her just, try to keep her neck from falling off. And I just had her do some arm movement. That's really all I gave her. But the main program at home was really more closed chain, even though her meaningful movements were open chain.
Yeah.
So that's
what gave her some differences, though. So awesome.
Yeah, that's cool. That was great.
Yeah.
So
thanks for sharing that story. It's just a nice way of just saying, watch the movement patterns, watch the functional movement patterns. And then, kind of try to see if you can do something that's going to change them. We don't really need to know, was it neural tension? Was it capsular? Was it this? Was it that? Well, it wouldn't have changed that fast if it was capsular. So we know that, she wasn't behaving, the movement wasn't freezing into the lack of, a capsular pattern because it was lack of internal rotation. In open chain, but in closed chain, it was lack of external. It's like, very different, just different things. And, how much does the hand have to come into play with it? I don't know. We're going to figure that out when she, comes back again. But, the idea is that, just really kind of figuring out that, the movement pattern has emerged, this faulty movement pattern or different movement pattern, whatever you want to call it, has emerged because that's what the central nervous system was left with after protecting the neck for so long.
Yeah.
And it may not have even started if her son wasn't trying to learn to drive and she was sitting in that other seat.
Right.
know,
Exactly.
and with the tension of that, and maybe constantly looking over at him, and
Exactly.
and the so who knows? We can't say that, oh, it's just because the neck was bad, now the shoulder's bad, because she got herself in a different situation and she didn't have the ability. It didn't show itself until she needed to use it in a meaningful way in a different situation. Then all of a sudden it was like, this is unacceptable.
Right.
It could have been there for a while, but it just never show up because she never needed to reach behind her to the left until, but it may have started showing up as her, as increasingly harder to pull your clothes up.
But it's interesting. She never mentioned that.
Yeah.
Never said I can't put my bra on. Never.
Yeah, because people just accommodate and they figure it out as they go. But then you get the extreme position of her sitting in the passenger seat and trying to reach behind. All of a sudden, it becomes very obvious. Like, I haven't been able. Why can I not do? Why can I not do that?
Yeah.
What's going on here? Yeah. And so it's like, wow, I had no idea that I wasn't able to do that. And then that starts the whole thing off. So awesome.
Yeah.
Thank you for sharing this.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you, everybody.
Yeah, thanks, everybody. We look forward to your input. And if you haven't done so, we're on our pace to get 150 reviews. So we're at podcast number 104 today. And I think we're close to 104 reviews too.
Yes.
So keep them coming. Thank you.
Thank you.
And for all the new listeners that have joined, us, let us hear from you and opt into our website so you can get our newsletters. All right.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.